Welcome to the CDA Institute's Expert Series, the podcast that brings you critical discussions with thought leaders in defense, security, and global affairs. I'm your host, Josh Malm. The CDA Institute encourages rigorous debate on national security matters through our events, research, and publications. In today's episode, former Defense Minister and CDA Honorary Member Peter MacKay spoke with us about this week's NATO Summit and the biggest challenges and opportunities for Canada. This is the Expert Series. Peter, like I said, thanks again so much for taking some time to speak with the Institute again. There's a lot going on in the world right now. Obviously, the international security environment. You've got tensions in the South China Sea. You have revisionist powers like Iran, China. You have the war in Ukraine. And we have potential political instability or uncertainty to the south of us as well. This is kind of all setting the scene and setting the stage for the NATO Summit. And then, of course, over the past year, Canada has received a fair amount of criticism for its defense spending, but we also released a defense policy update. So all this in mind and situating our viewers, what would you say are maybe the top issues for Canada at this week's NATO Summit?
Well, I think the one that will very quickly rise to the top of the heap, and you've quite accurately outlined the geopolitical instability and military aggression that we are seeing from adversaries around the globe, and even parts of Africa as well could flash as hotspots, further unrest in many parts of the world, internally and external forces. But for Canada, the highlighted issue will be our military spending and investment in domestic capabilities. Domestic capabilities also mean deployable capabilities, but Canada has been pegged as being one of the few of the 32 member NATO countries that are below, and I would say well below, the 2% spending floor that was agreed to in 2014, but has been agreed to at other NATO summits more recently. And so that, I think, is going to put Canada, pardon the pun, in the crosshairs of other NATO countries, most notably the United States, for not living up to their expectations and not being sufficiently willing or able to share the burden that NATO countries have agreed to.
Do you think that this summit being the 75th anniversary holds any particular significance at all?
Well, it does, certainly, for all the reasons that we've already talked about in terms of the pressures militarily and politically that are on a slow and sometimes steady boil. But the 75th anniversary reminds Canada and others that we were one of the founding nations of NATO. We have been there throughout post-Second World War II and onward to today's date, a significant contributor and a country that was always seen, and it's become a bit of an acronym now, but punching above its weight, and really a reliable, steady ally. And that is being brought into question. And, you know, again, to mix metaphors here, you're only as good as your last at bat, but Canada now is being painted as a laggard. And that's not something certainly that we should be comfortable with. And I know for certain it's not something our military are comfortable with. And so what do we do about it? It's more than just investments. It has to be a real steadfast commitment from government. And it's going to take time, just like a muscle that atrophies. It's going to take time to rebuild capability and readiness. And so that hopefully has begun. You referenced Minister Blair's defense update. But even that update, and the flaw that is apparent, is it doesn't get us to 2%. I think it calculates to about 1.76% by 2030. But what's glaring is the absence of a plan to get to 2% in the near term.
You bring up the defense policy update again, Peter. I'm wondering, have you had a chance to take a look at the DPU at all? And if so, I'm curious what some of your thoughts are about the document.
Well, I have. I read it as soon as it came out, and I've gone back and sort of revisited parts of it. What stands out is that a lot of it really, Josh, are post-dated commitments. Most, if not all of it, would not take effect until after an election in 2025. But really, the bigger muscle movements won't occur for 5, 10, 15 years out. And that, frankly, is unacceptable. It's unacceptable. It should be to Canadians, and it's certainly unacceptable to the allies, the 32, who are making those very serious and very substantial investments in their military. I think, and I stand to be corrected, the number is about 23 of 32 who will meet the 2% within the next calendar year. And then every other country of those 32, with the exception of Canada and Belgium, have laid out a path to get to 2% in the coming years. So we are really an outlier at NATO now, and it's something that those who are working towards this goal are feeling very uncomfortable with.
A very striking piece of news just came out ahead of the summit today. So the government said it would reach 1.76% defense spending by 2030. But I believe it was yesterday in the National Post, the PBO estimates a gradual decline from a peak of 1.49 in 2025 to 2026. So what do you make of this revelation? And do you think it could have any impact on discussions this week at the summit? And if so, how do you maybe envision the government addressing this issue at the summit?
Well, Josh, that's a very good question. And the point about the Parliamentary Budget Office coming out with figures that directly contradict the defense update that show we will not even reach that insufficient amount of 1.76 in the next 5 years is very troubling and will feed the narrative that Canada is not meeting its commitment, is not living up to the burden, to the expectation that we share with other NATO countries. The Parliamentary Budget Office is a non-partisan body, like the Auditor General, that is there to check the numbers and to hold the government to account. There was another factor that we saw just a few weeks ago where 23 U.S. senators, a bipartisan group, wrote a letter to the Prime Minister calling him out again for a lack of plan and for a lack of investment in military. And so all of this has left Canada really in an uncomfortable position as the NATO summit kicks off to be on the defensive in trying to somehow justify or answer these calls. There's another consideration here, particularly in the minds of the American administration, and that is a revelation, I believe, that came from the Washington Post of a leaked memo from the Pentagon, wherein the Prime Minister said to officials a few months ago, Canada will never meet its 2% spending commitment, which, again, it boggles the mind why he would have said that, but it's further putting us in a position where we are looking very lame as a country when it comes to our own security, those of our allies, particularly here in North America. And there will be consequences. I don't know what those consequences will be. And we can talk about the possibility of a Trump administration. But if and when that happens, I suspect there will be consequences, either in terms of trade, sanctions, the way Canada is treated in global bodies, and the way we are viewed by not just the Americans, but our European allies and others who we have been steadfast in standing beside in times of conflict.
So I suppose it's rather unpredictable still from this vantage point, given Mr. Trump's track record, Peter. But to what extent do you think Canada might feel more pressure to enhance defense spending in NATO should a new administration come through in November?
I think there will be a greater degree of public pressure on the current Liberal government if a Trump administration is elected in the fall. I think you're going to see increased calls from other countries in the alliance, including Germany and France, who have increased their spending by billions of dollars. And so it cuts both ways when Canada continues to sort of be obstinate and refusing to either give explanation or, more critically, to give commitments and to lay out a path, because it also allows European countries to point to Canada and say, you see, not all the allies are doing their part, and therefore we're going to delay our spending as well. Conversely, if we were to step up and reprioritize government spending that allowed us to get to 2%, this would be inspirational to those who are in the same boat, so to speak, and need to do more. It also, frankly, emboldens our our adversaries when they see a fight in the alliance, when they see criticisms of some member countries like ours who are not living up to the billing. That emboldens them. That fills their hearts with joy. The Vladimir Putins, the Xi Jinpings, the terrorist elements out there, when they see disunity and unraveling within NATO. And so that's an unspoken and difficult to quantify reality, but it's undeniable. And so again, further motivation for us to do more.
Peter, this next question is kind of two questions in one, so hopefully you can bear with me for a moment. I think this would be curious. I think our audience would be curious about this first portion. What is it like being a defense minister at the summit? And from your experiences, and this is the second part of the question, what do you think conversations between Canada and our allies might be looking like right now behind closed doors, particularly concerning our defense spending commitments?
Well, Josh, the first part of your question is a personal reflection, and it was both daunting and a very serious feeling of commitment to be at these summits on behalf of our country in the role of defense minister. I served in that role during a time in which we were in a very serious conflict in Afghanistan, fighting alongside not only NATO countries, but a coalition that came from 64 other countries who were on the ground to various degrees doing both military and humanitarian aid work. And so there were a lot of moving parts, not unlike today, but to suggest at that time we were in an open conflict. We were, at least on the ascendancy and approaching the 2%, in large part because of major military purchases and accelerated procurement plans that we had put in place. I had the good fortune to have a very supportive Prime Minister and Minister of Finance that allowed us to purchase at record speed heavy lift helicopters, heavy lift aircraft, long range guns, the demining equipment that was needed in Afghanistan, new uniforms, new guns. We were spending at such a rate that it was hard to keep pace with the money that was coming in and spending it on time, frankly. So it was a very, very different time, and nobody would be accusing Canada of not doing enough. In fact, I recall very poignantly, given today's circumstance, being at those NATO tables and literally hammering the table for other countries to do more. We had the highest casualty rate, which is not something you ever want to boast about, but that was demonstrable of the need to get that equipment and to get the support of other countries quickly. That also, is a firm reminder as to what this is all about. This is about the preservation of life, the ability to support our men and women in uniform in their missions to come home safely, to perform to the best of their ability with the best protection available. And the unlimited liability that they take on is something that the political class, politicians, ministers, public servants need to recall often and keep in the front of their minds as to what this is about. So, it was a real honor to attend those summits in that capacity as a minister. There was a great deal of preparation that went into it. I was supported well, both by the civilian and military members of the Department of National Defense. And we held a place of pride at those tables, given what we were doing, given what Canada has done consistently since the Department of National Defense was stood up. And so we're a country with a strong reputation, but as I said earlier, that reputation can be squandered very quickly. And so that part is poignant to reflect upon. The other question with respect to the discussion, I suspect that the private conversations will be somewhat different than what will be stated in the open sessions at the NATO summit. I think the private discussions will be a little bit more direct and I dare say even accusatory of Canada not pulling its weight and not getting behind their commitments and delivering. I think that the biggest pressure, of course, will come from the United States. Interestingly, President Biden will be under a great deal of pressure to be sharp and to be on his game. A lot of questions after the debate a few weeks ago, or I guess just over a week ago. And so he may take this occasion to appear a little bit more direct and aggressive in calling out Canada. I know there's been numerous expressions from European countries and allies that are fed up, that are frustrated. And so on the margins of the meeting itself, you may hear some of that reported. But this is a critical point, to say the least. Ukraine is going to dominate the discussion. Canada has made contributions, unquestionable, major and important contributions. But some of that has not been delivered as yet. And some of the policy issues, which I won't get into here, need to be given a full airing. And frankly, the most important one being Ukraine's NATO membership. And I hope Canada will speak up very aggressively and positively in favor of Ukraine joining the alliance.
Well, thank you for that, Peter. On the note of Ukraine, actually, I'd like to focus on that for another minute or so. I recently spoke with Mr. David Pratt on the podcast, who, as you will know, was also defense minister, and he sort of compared the significance of the war in Ukraine and the current geopolitical dynamic to that of the one that preceded the Second World War. So I'm just curious if you could weigh in. How significant do you think the war in Ukraine has been in changing or altering the global security context?
Oh, I think it's been hugely significant. I don't think it can be overstated. It has brought Europe to the brink of war. NATO arguably has never been feeling more threatened, going back perhaps to a period during the Cold War, where Russia is testing the alliance. And this has been an ongoing effort by Vladimir Putin. But now, having crossed the territorial boundaries of a neighboring country, and this goes back, of course, to 2014 when Russia first entered Crimea illegally. And what is going on to this very moment is the relentless rocketing of cities and towns inside the sovereign territory of Ukraine, the removal of children, we know, and all sorts of other atrocities, human rights violations. So there's no question that this is the moment in time for NATO member countries and other countries to step into the breach and help Ukraine defend itself. It's a moment where we have to be clarion in our objectives. And if we're not assisting to the greatest extent possible Ukraine to defend itself, we will be facing Russia again in another field of operations, potentially in another country in the near future. If Russia succeeds, we all lose.
Peter, we've skimmed over this topic just for a minute or so earlier on in this discussion. But as you know, there's a bit of debate on the 2% threshold. Some say it's an arbitrary number. Some say it's important to fulfill as part of our commitment to the alliance. And then, some might say also that while arbitrary, perhaps it still exemplifies solidarity with allies, and that makes it a worthy goal in of itself. So I'm just curious, once again, if you might be able to reiterate where you stand on the whole 2% debate.
Well, I feel very strongly that we need to get to 2% and aspirationally exceed 2%. We are a founding nation, as we spoke of earlier, within NATO. We have huge obligations here on the continent of North America with respect to the Arctic, which in and of itself, Josh, if we were to make the necessary commitments in the Arctic, including contemplation of nuclear submarines and more permanent installations in our Arctic, radar installation, the necessary cooperation through missile defense of our northern flank, that would get us very close, if not to the 2% threshold. And so I'm a strong believer that, and this is not saber rattling or militarizing in an overly aggressive way. It's simply the reality to meet the challenge and to meet the threat. And so I believe that it has to get much higher priority from government. It needs to be part of Canada's short-term and long-term spending commitment. And I also strongly believe that there has been an awakening in the public, in large part because of being inundated with news reports of what's happening on the doorstep of Europe, in Ukraine, what's happening, as you pointed out at the outset, in the South China Sea, the Middle East, and that ongoing conflict between Hamas and Israel. So these are very real and very lethal engagements. And Canada is not living in splendid isolation. We have to be prepared to do our part, and in particular, to do our part here at home, domestically. And we know the armed forces are often called upon to assist civil authority. And even during the pandemic, we saw them play a major role in helping and supporting Canadian citizens as they do during disaster relief. So that 2% has a lot of resonance and ramifications across the country and across the world. And we need to get on board. We need to do what we have done previously and ramp up, which I'm quick to add also has an economic benefit when done properly. We need to manufacture more equipment. We need to build more things for ourselves and potentially for our allies. We have the innovation, we have that capability, but it's atrophied, and no one is going to do it for us.
One final question for you, Peter, and thanks for being so generous with your time, and thanks for a great interview. Another personal reflection. You are, and I don't need to remind our audience, one of the longest serving defense ministers. Based on your experience in the role, could you describe perhaps some of the challenges you observed in terms of advocating for higher defense spending and even potentially recalibrating our procurement system to be more efficient? And from there, perhaps what are some of the challenges you observed, and what advice might you give to individuals focusing on these files today?
Well, I think starting with one of your latter comments with respect to the complexity and the malaise that surrounds military procurement, there has to be, and there is, a more efficient way for Canada to purchase equipment, or, as I said earlier, build equipment in a way that will deliver for the forces in a more timely fashion. Other countries have done it. And when it comes to public policy implementation, it pays to look at other allies and other nations in terms of trying to find best practices. Bringing together almost a department in and of itself for military procurement has been tried. And I would suggest it's now the time for us to implement something like this in Canada, given the enormity of the task before us. We've embarked on the National Shipbuilding Procurement Strategy that worked, although it hasn't been completed by any stretch of the imagination, but we were able to procure at record speed, particularly the supply ships that were needed. We were able to accelerate some of the purchases, albeit in a time of war when we were in Afghanistan. And so there is recent examples of how we have, in fact, been able to succeed in a more rapid procurement process and strategy. And so that to me is something well worth pursuing by the department, and in cooperation with Treasury Board, Industry Canada, and public procurement practices, bringing these various departments together, Public Works. So that's one big challenge. The other is communication that brings it to the public in a way that they understand both the pressing nature of this military investment, the benefits that come with having a top-notch military, but the cost associated with it. We have some of, I believe, our best citizens really serving in the military. There's a crossover between a lot of our emergency responders who are working in the reserves. We have a very capable reserve unit in most communities across the country now that contribute mightily and train, but we can't expect them to do that on their own dime. We can't ask that much of them and not give them proper support. And so the reserve system itself needs an injection of both resources and respect. We've drifted somewhat from the mandate with what can only be described as sort of a woke makeover that has caused a lot of resistance and irritation in the forces. And I want to be very clear on this point, Josh. This is not for a moment to suggest that there wasn't a need to address some of the issues, particularly around harassment and violence and sexual violence. That's a given. We have to do something about that, and we have been doing something about that in fairness to those who are tasked with a response. But the lessening of some of the standards, the loosening of regulations, even around things that may not seem as critical to some, but things like uniforms and comportment and the way in which the units themselves portray themselves. This has been sort of under attack in a way that has a very corrosive impact. And we're seeing that play out with recruitment and retention and just an overall feeling of being somewhat downgraded is a word that I've heard used by serving members and veterans. And so that has to be addressed as well. There's an opportunity for a reset here. We have a new chief of defense staff. As I said, I think the public are increasingly aware, and there's a lot of concern about where the forces are today, the numbers themselves. And I heard something just the other day that half of our equipment is either unavailable or unserviceable. That's a shocking revelation to think that we have such an undeployable military when it comes to our equipment. And so there is a lot of work to be done. And I want to remain hopeful, glass half full, that we will get there and make that necessary investment and commitment and turn the corner on what has been a very difficult period for serving members and their families. They want and deserve to be respected for what they do. We need to bring in a new generation of service members, and they want to know that they're entering into one of the greatest institutions our country has ever had, and that is our Canadian Armed Forces.
Well, Peter, your final remarks there are particularly salient and poignant as well. So I think that's a good place to close out this interview today. I just want to thank you once again for being so generous with your time and also for making time for the CDA Institute today. I think this interview is important, and it'll be good for our audience to listen to, especially with the NATO Summit going on. I think it'll be a great educational resource for them as well. So once again, thanks to have you on, and hope we can do this again sometime in the future.
Well, it's been my pleasure, Josh, and thanks to the CDA and Joe Varner and other members who does such great work when it comes to the education and information around Canada's defense. And I feel very privileged to associate myself with their good work. So it's been my pleasure to speak with you today.
Thank you very much, Peter, and have a great weekend as well. That's all for this week's episode of the CDA Institute's Expert Series. To learn more about the CDA Institute, you can visit our website at www.cdainstitute.ca or subscribe to our newsletter. Thanks, and we hope you'll be tuning in next time.